Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812 was the beginning of his disastrous campaign.
His army, numbering around 600,000, advanced into the Russian heartland.
The Russians, under Tsar Alexander I, adopted a scorched earth strategy, systematically retreating and destroying resources that could support Napoleon's army.
Farmers burned their crops and villages to prevent Napoleon's troops from using the land for food and shelter.
As Napoleon's army advanced, they found them without supplies, forced to rely on long and
Vulnerable supply lines that were increasingly stretched.
The extended supply lines made it impossible for the French to maintain their fighting strength, especially as the Russians continued their retreat and destruction.
As Napoleon's forces marched deeper into Russia, they were met by the infamous Russian winter, which brought freezing temperatures and snow. Napoleon's troops were ill-prepared for the cold, with many soldiers succumbing to frostbite, disease, and exhaustion. The extreme conditions of the Russian winter became a major factor in the downfall of Napoleon's army, as they were unprepared for such harsh environments.
The scorched earth policy forced Russian civilians to retreat with the army, leaving behind empty, burned villages in the wake of the destruction.
Napoleon's men began to lose hope, their morale shattered by the unrelenting cold and their growing hunger.
As Napoleon advanced deeper into Russia, his supply lines grew longer and increasingly vulnerable, making it impossible to sustain such a massive army.
Napoleon's soldiers faced the devastating reality of being isolated, far from reinforcements or any meaningful support. The longer the campaign dragged on, the weaker Napoleon's army became, with many soldiers dropping out due to exhaustion and disease.
Napoleon's forces were desolated by attrition, with his army shrinking rapidly as they fought on in the harsh Russian conditions.
Napoleon's communication lines were stretched thin, and any hope of getting reinforcements was fading fast. The lack of adequate supplies and reinforcements left Napoleon with no choice but to continue, even as his army faltered.
Crossing rivers and difficult terrain further stretched Napoleon's supply lines, leaving him vulnerable to Russian attacks. As the French moved deeper into Russia, the scarcity of supplies became a critical issue, as the Russians destroyed everything they could. Napoleon's army was now cut off from its base, with no feasible means of retreat or resupply.
Napoleon's soldiers were now desperate, searching for food wherever they could, yet the scorched earth policy left them with nothing.
The Battle of Borodino in September 1812 was a decisive and bloody confrontation, where Napoleon's forces faced off against the Russian army.
Napoleon's army suffered heavy casualties in the battle, but it was still technically a French victory, with the Russians retreating.
Despite victory on the battlefield, Napoleon's forces were severely weakened, and morale was low after such a costly engagement.
The Russian forces retreated, but they inflicted devastating losses on the French, making the victory Pyrrhic for Napoleon.
Napoleon's forces eventually reached Moscow, hoping to force the Russian government into surrender, but what awaited him was a city in flames.
The Russians, having abandoned the city, set Moscow on fire, denying Napoleon's army any shelter or supplies.
Napoleon's victory in Moscow was hollow, as the city lay in ruins, offering nothing to sustain his army. With Moscow in flames and winter approaching, Napoleon's army was left without shelter, food, or hope. With no clear victory in sight and no way to maintain his army, Napoleon was forced to make the difficult decision to retreat. By October 1812, Napoleon's grand campaign had turned into a disastrous retreat, as the Russian winter closed in. As Napoleon's army retreated from Moscow, they faced the brutal Russian winter, which destroyed the already weakened French forces.
The freezing temperatures, combined with the lack of food and supplies, caused many soldiers to die from exposure and fatigue. Throughout the retreat, Russian forces and partisans relentlessly harassed Napoleon's army, further weakening their position. The French army's retreat from Russia was a long and harrowing journey, with Napoleon losing thousands of men along the way. Napoleon's men were cold, hungry, and demoralized, facing one of the harshest winters in memory. Russian partisans continued to attack French supply convoys, ensuring that Napoleon's retreat became even more difficult.
By the time Napoleon reached Poland, only a fraction of his original army remained, and the campaign was effectively lost. The retreat was marked by suffering, with soldiers falling from starvation, disease, and Russian attacks. Napoleon's once mighty army had been reduced to a shattered, demoralized force by the time they crossed into Poland. Napoleon's Russian campaign, which had begun with such promise, ended in catastrophic failure. Napoleon's overconfidence in his military abilities led him to misjudge the difficulty of invading Russia.
Despite his general's warnings, Napoleon pressed forward with his invasion, dismissing the logistical challenges that lay ahead.
The vastness of Russia and its unforgiving environment were never fully accounted for in Napoleon's strategy. The terrain proved just as difficult as the weather, with Napoleon's army often bogged down in mud and swampy conditions. Napoleon's frustration grew as his grand plans unraveled, and his army grew weaker by the day.
The further Napoleon's army retreated, the more troops surrendered to Russian forces, abandoning their comrades in the face of overwhelming adversity.
In hindsight, many of Napoleon's officers believed that retreating earlier would have spared his army from complete destruction.
Napoleon's isolation in Moscow, with no reinforcements or supplies coming, was a key reason why his campaign faltered. Napoleon's personal suffering mirrored that of his army, as he realized that his great ambition had led him into a disastrous campaign. The once invincible French army now found itself retreating in disarray, its strength shattered by the combined forces of Russia and nature. Napoleon's strategic miscalculations in Russia set the stage for his downfall, leading to a loss of confidence in his leadership. By the time Napoleon's forces reached Poland, their morale was completely destroyed, and the once proud army had been decimated. The freezing temperatures continued to claim the lives of Napoleon's soldiers as they struggled to survive the Russian winter.
Napoleon's generals were now questioning his leadership, as the campaign had failed to achieve any of its objectives.
For the soldiers, the emotional toll of the campaign was as devastating as the physical hardships they faced.
By the time Napoleon's army crossed into Poland, it was a shell of its former self, crippled by the campaign's failure. Despite the calamity, Napoleon tried to restore order and morale, but it was clear that his campaign had ended in failure.
As they retreated, Napoleon's army was relentlessly pursued and harassed by Russian partisans, making their situation even more dire. By the time they returned to France, Napoleon's army was decimated, with over 400,000 men lost during the campaign.
The news of his army's catastrophic loss in Russia shook Napoleon to his core.
Napoleon's confidence had been shattered, and his isolation from his advisors left him struggling to comprehend the scale of his failure.
The failure in Russia significantly weakened Napoleon's empire as his conquests began to erode and European powers turned against him.
Napoleon's once loyal generals began to question his leadership, seeing the disastrous Russian campaign as a turning point for the emperor.
With no clear military path forward, Napoleon was forced to reconsider his strategy and deal with the consequences of his overconfidence.
Napoleon, ever the strategist, tried to rally his remaining forces, but the reality of his loss was too great for words to restore their morale.
Napoleon's army returned to Europe in shambles, a fraction of its original size, unable to continue their aggressive campaigns. The failure in Russia led to a shift in European power dynamics, with countries like Prussia and Austria joining forces to challenge Napoleon's rule.
Napoleon's retreats from Poland symbolized his declining influence in Europe.
The failure in Russia gave rise to the Sixth Coalition, a united front against Napoleon made up of Britain, Russia, Prussia, and other powers.
Napoleon's remaining forces were too exhausted to mount another campaign, with morale completely depleted after the catastrophic losses.
As Napoleon's grip on Europe weakened, the Sixth Coalition marched towards Paris, aiming to decisively end his reign.
Now outnumbered and outmaneuvered, Napoleon was forced to make strategic decisions with a significantly diminished army.
Napoleon, once a master of battlefield tactics, found himself on the defensive, unable to replicate his previous triumphs.
The Battle of Leipzig, known as the Battle of Nations, saw Napoleon's support to the Prussian armies.
After the defeat at Leipzig, Napoleon was forced to retreat, his forces in disarray and unable to hold on to the territories he had once dominated.
By 1814, Napoleon was left with no choice but to surrender to the Sixth Coalition.
Napoleon was exiled to the island of Elba, far from the glory he once held, his empire now a shadow of its former self.
While some mourned Napoleon's exile, others saw it as the end of tyranny, ushering in a new era for France. Napoleon's failure in Russia marked the beginning of the end for his empire, with the loss of key territories and the eventual dissolution of the French Empire.